Hi, everybody. Today we're going to start in sort of the last unit of the course, in which we're going to talk about what responsibilities we have as game designers within a social and cultural context. And we're also sort of continuing our conversations that we had last week when we talked about sort of practical issues in game design. Only now we're talking about practical issues in terms of how our games impact real world issues, politics, and the sort of society that we live in. And I want to begin today by talking about Anita Sarkeesian. Now, if you haven't heard of her, that would be understandable. A lot of this happened when you were younger, and she's sort of out of the spotlight a little bit now. But in about 2012, Anita Sarkeesian was maybe one of the most important individual figures in games culture. And this is because she released a series of videos called Tropes versus Women in Video Games. And specifically, she began a Kickstarter to fund the creation of these games. And the Kickstarter was like 1,000% funded. It was extremely popular. But with that popularity came thousands of harassers, basically. People doxed her, so they released her information, her private information online. People, sent her threatening phone calls, emails. Now this stuff is kind of almost commonplace, which is really frightening, but back then it was essentially unheard of for this to happen, especially on such a huge scale. This phenomenon became known as Gamergate, which some of you may have heard of, but Gamergate ended up spinning off into other movements that became sort of anti-feminist, in many cases racist and homophobic, political and social movements online, and many people who were involved in Gamergate were funneled into right-wing movements that helped to put Donald Trump in power in 2016. So a lot of people talked about Gamergate as the sort of canary in the coal mine of the kinds of really scary cultural trends that we're seeing these days. And at the center of it was Anita Sarkeesian, who, as you saw, or as you will see in your readings this week, essentially was making an argument that women need to be represented more and need to be represented better in video games. So whenever you hear somebody try to dismiss the importance of video games or of representation in video games as irrelevant to sort of broader cultural and social conversations, think about the story of Anita Sarkeesian. And think about how your games might relate to that. So what is representation, anyways? Now, there's sort of two broad versions of the discussion of representation that we can have, and you're probably familiar with some of them if you've had any kinds of debates about, the merits of particular, television shows, movies, whatever. We tend to talk about representation when it comes to popular media specifically. So the first kind is when we talk about the degree to which specific experiences or identities appear in media. This is like, my favorite television series has only one female character. All of the shows I watched when I was a kid were all stories with all white characters. There were no queer characters in any of the games I played when I was younger. This is sort of very basic question. Are there people of a certain experience or identity category in the media that I consume? The second version is a little more nuanced, and it talks about the way in which specific experiences or identities are portrayed in popular media. So this might involve characters' appearance. If we only ever see very feminine-looking women or women wearing skimpy outfits, this is a form of representation that we can discuss. Their role in the story. Princess Peach is a sort of famous example of bad representation of women because she is the only major female character in Mario and is always a damsel in distress. And we might also talk about the effect on the audience that a character that characters of a specific identity have. So, for example, maybe you have a lot of women characters, but they're only ever used as sort of sex appeal characters for an assumed male audience. Or, maybe you have a number of Latino characters, but they all are portrayed as sort of comic relief. And there's no characters who are given a serious story. That might be an example of bad representation, even if there's lots of Latino characters in your story. So when we talk about representation, we can talk broadly or we can talk specifically. Broadly means sort of broad cultural trends, and this is what Anita Sarkeesian talks about a lot, is sort of what are the, in all the games that were made in the past 5 years, how many of them had main female characters? These kinds of questions. And we can also talk specifically, so we can look at a specific game and use it as an example of good or bad representation. Why does representation matter? So there's a really famous study that was done in television studies where I think it was either an interview or a survey format, but they surveyed sort of thousands of people who watched crime procedural television shows, so like CSI, Criminal Minds, Law and Order, these kinds of shows. And they found that these people, regardless of where they lived or the crime rate of where they lived, they believed that the crime rate was higher than it was where they lived, and they had an outsized conception of how good the police were at combating crime. And they tended to support approaches to crime prevention that emphasize the police. So representation on a broad scale does matter. It can affect the attitudes and perceptions that people have about broader social issues or groups of people. If all you consume, or if you consume a lot of media that tells you a certain thing about a certain group of people, you may start to adopt this attitude. So one example that's very dear to my heart, of course, is trans representation. And for years and years, the only kind of trans representation that you would see on television is the sort of man in the dress joke character. And, a lot of people I know, especially older people who grew up with that kind of image as the only image of sort of anything from cross-dressing to transitioning. When you grow up with that image, then you know somebody who actually transitions, like a trans woman, you tend to have a really negative view, or you see it as a joke, you see it as funny. So having good representation can combat these kinds of attitudes and help them to shift, which is one reason why it really matters. Another reason why it matters is because it impacts the people who identify with the same kinds of experiences that the people have in the media that they're consuming. So, if I see a trans character on a TV show or in a video game, and I identify with them, they become a role model for me, and they help me understand what I can do and what I can be in this world better, right? And for the game industry, there's a lot of room for new and interesting forms of representation. Up until very recently, I think these days we're seeing a lot of really interesting, women characters and characters of color, and even queer characters. But for years and years, there was really nothing at all. All of the characters, the main characters in games, were by default like white, cis, straight men. One example that was exciting to me that came out a couple of years ago is Dishonored, Death of the Outsider, which was a sort of DLC, large-scale DLC for the second Dishonored game, which starred Black, queer, disabled women. So centering new stories or stories that haven't been told can push the game industry in new directions that are really exciting. But what is good representation in games? And I've put I think this is a very open question, and it really depends on the specific kinds of experience that you're trying to portray. So good queer representation is obviously going to be very different from good Black representation or good representation of Asian characters, right? But here are a few questions to sort of get you started thinking about good representation in games. You might ask, what can the player do and what can the character do? So if we're talking about a player character, you might ask, you know, what kinds of actions can they perform? If it's not a player character, you might ask what can be done to them. So one problem Media Sarkeesian talks about at length is the way that many women in games are portrayed as sort of objects that you can pick up and throw around. And specifically, a lot of sex workers are portrayed this way, which gives a very sort of bad impression, makes sex worker characters into a sort of joke that you can like throw them around or like hurt them, harm them. Why do you want to portray this person or this job or this sort of set of actions in this way? Is another broad question to ask yourself. Are you just doing it because this is a sort of kind of media that you enjoyed as a kid? Or are you trying to do it because you want to push the boundaries of what can be done or what kinds of stories you can tell? What experience do you have? This isn't to say that, you know, you can never write characters that are outside of your experience, but it might be helpful to ask somebody who does have that experience if you don't, or to consume media with very positively discussed portrayals of characters. So for example, if you're including a Black character in your game, you might want to consume media that is written by Black people to get a sort of waypoint as to how you might better represent your character. And what broader trends are you participating in and what are you subverting? So if you decide to make just another sort of like violent action game, or if you want to make another game where a character can go to like a brothel or something, like ask yourself why you want to do that and what maybe harmful trends you're contributing to. Ask what you can subvert or what you can do differently or make more interesting. And this sort of brings us to the second part of the class, which is procedural rhetoric. Now, procedural rhetoric was made by a guy who I think I've already dunked on in this class. His name's Ian Bogost, and he has a lot of weird takes about games. He really thinks that simulations like The Sims or, SimCity or something are the best kinds of games. Like games shouldn't have characters and they shouldn't have stories and all of this. So some of this we should take with a grain of salt. But he also came up with this concept called procedural rhetoric, which is very, very useful for us as game designers. And there's sort of three central points which bring Ian Bogost to procedural rhetoric. The first is that media make arguments about the world that we live in. So the kinds of portrayals that we see on screen don't just leave us when we turn off the television or leave our game console or leave the movie theater or whatever. Media say things about the world that we go back to at the end. And number two is that games have the unique ability to make arguments through the ways that the player interacts with the game. So movies might make arguments through the plot, through what the characters go through the representation of characters of certain identity groups. For example, a lot of people dunk on Batman for having a really bad sort of political message that we should let billionaires fix everything and that they're fundamentally good people and that crime is just a matter of like individual bad people as opposed to a systemic issue. But games uniquely can make arguments not just through a story, but through the ways that the player interacts with the game system and the way that the game system operates. And this is what Bogost calls procedural rhetoric. It's the argument that a game makes, so its rhetoric, through its mechanics and systems, or its procedures. And how do we find a game's procedural rhetoric? So I want to go back a second to the previous slide and discuss why I included SimCity as the image for this. SimCity is essentially a simulation of a city, as it says in the tin. But what's interesting about it is that one of the elements of city development in some of these games is crime. And the way that you reduce crime in a neighborhood in SimCity is by adding a police station. And so I think this is a really clear example of procedural rhetoric. SimCity is making the argument tacitly, whether the designers intended this or not, that the way that you reduce crime is with crime enforcement with the police, and that the police are a successful way to combat crime. So how do we arrive at this conclusion about SimCity or about other games like it? One way is to ask, how do players win or succeed? How do you overcome certain obstacles? What works and what doesn't work? What can't players do? What strategies are bad or unsuccessful? So, other kinds of strategies to prevent crime, which might involve like investment in communities or building community centers, or changing the zoning of your city so that different groups of people have access to things and you don't have neighborhoods that are sort of isolated without access to critical resources. These kinds of things don't reduce crime in SimCity, so they're unsuccessful. And this plays into the sort of procedural rhetoric by which the police are a successful solution to crime. What can non-player characters and objects do? For example, if you have like a cat in a game and it can't be friendly to you and can only attack you, I think this says something about cats in the real world, right? What do these things say about what it means to succeed or fail in our world? Or what it means to interact with a specific kind of thing in our world, right? And what assumptions does the game make about the characters or the setting that it's portraying based on these kinds of actions? I think a really classic example is like Settlers of Catan. In Settlers of Catan, you go to an uninhabited island and you settle it, and you gain points and win for developing it into a place with lots of people and extracting resources from the natural environment. And there's no discussion about the people who may already live on your island. There's no discussion about whether development or resource extraction is a good thing. And there's no discussion about what makes people happy, what makes your settlers happy. What seems to make them happy is to develop more. So Settlers of Catan is sort of... So what about the games that we design? And this is a tough one, because we can easily make games that have procedural rhetoric that we don't intend, right? So one way to sort of improve our games is to make sure that we're not doing that. And the way that you do that is to really think critically about the game throughout the design process and the kind of political messaging it has. And this is similar to thinking about good representation. So you might ask why you chose the subject matter that you did, why you chose the actions that you did. So for example, if we were making SimCity today, we might ask, why make a city building game in the first place? Why make a game where you are a god who can build a city from the ground up and sort of unilaterally make decisions about its development? You might ask what the winning strategy of your game is and why. I really doubt that the people who made SimCity were like super pro police or whatever, but I think that they didn't think about it. They thought well, we want to make crime into a sort of mechanic in the game that you have to contend with. And so one thing that you could do is have a police station. And the police station reduces crime, but it costs money. And it costs taxpayer money. And then you have to deal with your finances. And it's one more sort of resource that you have to manage. But they didn't ask, why am I making a simulation in which the police are the solution to crime, right? They're not asking themselves what this says about the city in real life, or cities in real life. So likewise, when you think about your games, try to really examine and maybe ask somebody else to think about what kinds of unquestioned assumptions are going into your design. Similarly, you should ask what players are encouraged to do and what they can't do, and why, right? So if you want to make another game that involves solving problems with violence, or another game in which you play as a cop or an investigator, ask yourself why players are encouraged to use specific methods to solve problems and not others. Why can't you, use debate or discussion or compromise to solve a problem? Why isn't that strategy encouraged? So I know this might be a lot to take in, and I don't want you to feel like you can't release a game unless it's like completely politically unproblematic. In fact, I really like SimCity. I think it's a fantastic game. I like Animal Crossing, even though Ian Bogos thinks that it's sort of a capitalist hellscape. And I really love Settlers of Catan. But one thing that's really exciting to me about games is that they have this potential to make really interesting arguments that films can't make. Procedural rhetoric isn't just a sort of thing to be careful of, and bad representation isn't just something to sort of worry about and be afraid of being canceled for. Games have a lot of room to grow in these areas, and you're entering the world of game design at a time when you can really expand the notion of what games are and what games can be and what games can make us think about and make us do. So, yeah, I hope that I didn't scare you too much. Next week, we're going to have a little break from talking about responsibility, and we're going to talk about affect and how to make your games have certain experiences. And then on the last week of the course, we'll discuss what responsibilities we have as game designers in terms of the kinds of experiences that we create, and that'll tie everything together, hopefully, in a neat, little bow for Christmas. Anyways, have a great week. I will talk to you all very soon.